about the snow? We have to go looking for it. It doesn't come to us. Climb over the bridge once more. Coming up shortly, in the foreground down to the left, we have a chemical storage facilities later. You'll see over to the left where the cranes are, there's a fairly tallish black glass structure, tallest building, at 297 metres. That is the Eureka Tower. The river flows through our city centre. Now, if you get an opportunity to see that water, in that the entry into it from Bass Strait, negotiate the narrow entry point, been ever on the increase in recent times. A lot of young people are finding it harder and harder to get into the housing market, particularly when you can a home loan. A lot of young people offer by way of things like the restaurants, also the theatres and the sporting events. And if they've got any money left over, they've been investing of recent times in the stock market. Our casino in Melbourne opened up back in 1997. Free accommodation at the hotel. The only part that didn't go according to script, the high rollers cleaned them out financially. Such was the dispensation from our state government to he literally bought the casino for a song and took over the running of the operation, gave it a much needed cash injection, and from that point on it started to turn a profit. They say there's an absolutely guaranteed way to come out of that casino with a small fortune. That's to go in there with a large fortune, they'll very happily reduce it for you. Well, here is the Yarra River we're crossing now, the river that flows through the heart of our city, the one that flows into Port Phillip Bay, like waterfall in it. Wasn't overly deep. I said earlier, Melbourne had two founding fathers, not just one. They came over here from Tasmania as rivals, certainly not as friends. And the Frenchman said that he had no interest in settling the land whatsoever, be of any consequence, but rather he was merely out here on a scientific and botanic expedition, collecting plants. In Melbourne, we had a late start to settlement by comparison with Sydney. Talking about our nice wide streets, yes. Gee, that was certainly done on cue, wasn't it? Well, when we get a bit further along, you see what I mean. Same length as a cricket pitch. And with the addition of the half chain on top, the extra 33 on top of the 66, that's how we got to be 99. That's our main shopping heart of the city. That's called the Burke Street Shopping Mall. I've just turned into Burke Street at the moment. So that's where we have our major department stores. Translated from the Latin into the English, that quite simply means plane tree. Street. I'm going to make our way down to it. We're now heading into the main commercial or business part of our city. Buildings that modernise the interiors. So here, this is the main commercial or business part of the city. As we proceed along a bit further on the left-hand side of the coach, one of the large insurance companies, which is called Sutton Corp. Now, I'm going to turn right. Who doesn't know the rules? There we go. I am now doing what we call a hook turn. The idea is to keep the tram tracks clear. Now that our lights turned red, I can finish the turn off and blend in with the green light we're now headed towards. Hook turns are applicable to several of Melbourne city intersections where the trams are in operation. As we proceed northbound along William Street, I know, for example, the next main intersection ahead of us is a hook turn. It tells me up in the wires there's a of what at one time were 3 such markets. Now, unfortunately, it's closed today, so we can't see it in operation. The first section we come by on the right is the general trading area, where they set up stalls. You could get footwear, clothing, auto accessories, leather goods, pets, souvenirs. Aren't overly large in size, so they provide facilities for patrons to dine on street level, al fresco. They put up weatherproofing. They also put out gas heating for patrons' comfort. So if you're looking for the best pizzas or pastas, gelati ice cream, espresso coffee or cappuccino, this is certainly the place to come and get it. Because there are so many restaurants up here, it's very, very competitive. You might see the IMAX sign over there to our left. That's our large screen theatre in the Carlton Gardens. That's it, just 1880. Now, it would be another 21 years after that exhibition before Australia became a country. The builder was a prominent builder in Melbourne of the time called David Mitchell. He did a lot of building work around Melbourne during that 1870s, 1880s period. He became a cult hero. Whenever he robbed banks, he didn't keep all the money for himself. Well, we're back in Collins Street, but we're at the eastern portion of the city this time. It was around that time that many of the doctors moved away to neighbouring East Melbourne, where the rents were cheaper, and the exclusive shops moved in. Now, as we swing the corner here on the right side of the coach, you'll see the beautiful old Treasury building. That one dates back to 1860-61. This is the Hotel Windsor. This was completed in 1883. Well, coming up on 27. The building itself dates back to 1856. Is our Roman Catholic cathedral in Melbourne called St Patrick's Cathedral. The architectural style is Gothic. The construction material is bluestone. Now, construction of this cathedral began in 1863. They finally finished it off in 1939. These gardens we're going to visit originally were a bluestone quarry. These are called the Fitzroy Gardens, named after Governor Fitzroy of New South Wales. If you were to get an aerial view of the layout of the paths, or indeed see them on a map, you'd note that they're in the shape of the Union Jack. Apart from the beautiful Flower Conservatory, which is the building across here to your left, is Cook's Cottage. Now, Captain James Cook was credited with the discovery of the Australian East Coast back in the year of 1770, well over 100 on the Fahrenheit scale. So they also closed the roofs on those tennis centre buildings to invoke a heat policy. When the temperature gets to about 36 degrees Celsius, they'll close the roofs. The players can then enjoy air-conditioned comfort. That magnificent crystal brown. Melbourne, they played an exhibition match against the Australian team at the Melbourne Cricket Ground. Now, that match was conducted on a Wednesday evening, midweek. Bear in mind, people had to work the next day. And people turned up to watch the game. Well, once again, I'm going to turn into Flinders Street. Before we became a country, we'd just been regarded as a dominion of England. When we did become a country, of course, it was a real time of national pride, when you consider we'd had people born here up until that time who hadn't known anywhere else as home. So in Federation Square, there's a big complex coming up to our left. There are many things, certainly some fine restaurants, bars and cafes. we have a division of our art gallery called the Ian Potter Gallery. It's where we have an impressive Australian art collection. You might see ACMI written on the side of this building. That stands for the Australian Centre of Moving Images. Now, just a couple of years ago in 2006, we had a big celebration on at the Moving Image Centre in regard to 50 years of television. Here's Federation Square on the left. You'll see the Australian Open sign. Just Roman Catholic Cathedral, St Patrick's. This is our Anglican Cathedral in Melbourne called St Paul's Cathedral. As we swing the corner here on the right side of the coach, you'll see Australian Open tennis shop we were speaking of earlier. They have the memorabilia and the souvenirs. Front of Flinders Street Railway Station actually tell you the departure time for the left if you follow the line of the river. On the right side of the coach coming up, we have three buildings that make up our Arts Centre complex. Now, the cylindrical wall, that's the home of the Melbourne Symphony Musical Comedy. The spire on the roof is lit up of an evening with lasers. It's supposed to represent a ballerina's tutu. And then as we come along a bit further, the next building on the right is the National Gallery of Victoria, which houses our international art collection. The Australian art collection at Federation Square at the Potter Gallery. Now, coming up on the left, you might see Melbourne's floral clock. Here in the park on the left, this floral clock was a gift to the people of Melbourne from the watchmakers of Switzerland during their exhibition here in 1966. So they say it takes some 7,000 plants to make up that display. Interesting to note, as you look at the National Gallery over to our right-hand side, it is supposedly built on the same dimensions as Noah's Ark in the Bible, where they used things like cubits as measurements. What would take place by way of the Second World War. So to one of those soldiers, in the courtyard of the shrine, we have a monument at the base of which is the eternal flame. He took office last year after our former governor, who happened to be an Olympic athlete by the name of John Landy, has served his 5-year term with distinction. Once again, we've come to St Kilda, and I could thoroughly recommend those cake shops to do the trick for you. They are simply sensational. Fairly high density of apartment living around here. Park, which is called Luna Park. This facility has been entertaining Melbourne children since 1912. Of course, being school holiday time, there are a host of other rides, and if you were to jump in a taxi, it would be way more expensive. $6 would barely get you off the landing at the pier in a taxi, so $6 return journey on the tram is excellent value. We've got the attraction of the beach over here. People could no longer afford the upkeep of them. So many of those grand mansions were torn down to make way for smaller type properties. As we come along a bit further, you'll see a former terraced houses mixed in with them. Well, we're going to be back at the ship in just a couple of moments on board the coach. So, if you could please have those, very industrial down here. This red and white will leave Devonport on Tasmania. Car on board and take it with you.
to the most dismal spot in the whole of Tasmania, burning. We're tied up to a dump of sticking wood chips, awaiting a ship to export them to Japan. More Tasmanian forests being destroyed to send off to Japan to make newspaper, toilet paper. Suddenly, from the blackest of nights, the jagged mountain peaks of New Zealand's South Island emerged from the gloom. It was only 4 a.m. and Volendam dawdled for a while, waiting for the first bit of sunlight to emerge and lighten up the scene a bit. We could see the lighthouse at the entrance to Milford Sound winking to us, but we had to wait until the pilot boat came out to put a pilot on board to help navigate this big ship up that narrow sound. And here we go. With the pilot on board, we can now move into the sound. We could see beyond some huge peaks rising, and we were heading towards them. And as we entered the narrow opening, looking back towards the sea, the rising sun was starting to colour the sea mist. It was still very dark within the sound, and the cliff faces were quite dark to look at, but fortunately the camera had a very good auto exposure mechanism which would adjust very well for the dark cliff faces and hillsides, and then compensate nicely if it encountered some brighter colouring from the sky. The pilot boat accompanied us all the way into this amazing waterway. These rock faces were very steep and thousands of feet high, and there were many waterfalls trickling down through crevices in the rock face from way above where the melting snow was feeding them. This waterfall has made its way through crevices in the rock face right down to the sound from thousands of feet above. And when one thinks that it is going 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, 366 some years, it's a lot of water coming down to the sound. This is Mitre Peak, which rises 5,640 feet straight out of the waters of Milford Sound. That makes it pretty tall, and it's melting snow from here which provides a lot of the water going into the sound. Under this melting snow is also a perpetual glacier. It's there forever. It doesn't melt, it stays there. And here we see two frolicking New Zealand fur seals enjoying playing games in the cool water of Milford Sound. Milford Sound is 16 kilometres long and is not usually as serene as it is now. We are extraordinarily lucky. In fact, this area receives such a large amount of precipitation that it leaves 3 to 4 metres of permanent freshwater layer above the warmer seawater below. The incomparable spectacle of Milford Sound, with waterfalls plunging hundreds of metres into the fjord, is really dramatic and quite unforgettable. The rising sun is now starting to touch the tops of some of the high peaks, and I think we have a rare treat today of taking in the extraordinary majesty and the cathedral silence of this area from probably the best place we could, aboard the MS Volendam, although not so silent where the ship is right now. courageous skipper has brought his 62,000 ton ship right into within 100 metres or so of high Bowen Falls, and he is surfing the wave coming from that huge amount of water hitting the Sound. Bowen Falls is 537 feet or 161 metres high. It's quite a sight to see. Later in the day, we would head out of Milford Sound and further south and go through Doubtful and Dusky Sounds before going around the very southern tip of the South Island between it and the island offshore, Stewart Island, and heading north then toward Dunedin. We had first seen Milford Sound 40 years ago, flying a little Cessna over snow-covered peaks into a stormy Milford Sound, but today was very, very different. The immensity of these sheer cliff faces rising from the Sound way above us made us feel that our ship below was almost like a toy boat, despite it being 62,000 tons, quite a big one. And I guess we just couldn't take our eyes off this quite astonishing scenery. Absolutely amazing scenery. And it went on and on and on. But we had to keep going. First, we would slowly dawdle back down Milford Sound, which was deep enough to allow us to get quite close to the shore in so many parts of it. And everywhere we went, we saw the magnificence of it, quite stunning. And of course there were some lucky people able to do it from the water too. And with Mitre Peak now in full sunshine and showing itself in its true splendour, we could really appreciate the immensity of the snow cap on the peak, and of course it had that hidden hanging glacier below it. Volendam stopped briefly to allow some passengers to disembark and travel overland to Dunedin to join us there next day. We're on our way down the Sound to the sea. And several cruise boats emerged to enjoy the delights of the Sound and wonderful Bowen Fall. Just look at those trees hanging onto those sheer cliffs. Amazing. On the way down the Sound, the smoke from our diesel exhaust shows that we will not leave the Sound as pristine as it was when we came here. Very sad. In the open sea and heading south, following the fog-white cloud. and suddenly we swung inland again to cruise through Milford Sound. This was nowhere near as interesting as Milford, nowhere near spectacular, but it was a good indication of what the glaciers had done in the past to tear out the land in the South Island of New Zealand and create fjord land. After cruising Doubtful, we will head to sea again and then turn inland into a far more interesting sound, but again nowhere near spectacular as Milford, and that one is called Dusky Sound and was travelled by Captain Cook way back in his voyage of discovery, and interesting facts about Captain Cook lie on the shores of Dusky Sound.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Captain with some updates, and for tomorrow, since later in the day there's all kinds of other programs going. The weather looks good. Tonight we'll be passing our most southern point of the cruise when we go in between the port of Bluff and Stewart Island. And actually in the Christmas cruise of 2009 we'll be anchoring at the harbour of Oban on Stewart Island. Some of you might think it's chilly, but some New Zealanders actually have summer homes on Stewart Island, and this is their summer, so that's what they are enjoying. And that's about it. If you miss it tomorrow morning, we sail the same route back out, so you can still see that after departure. But the Albatross, you'll see a lot of them this afternoon and evening again. And most of them belong to that colony there at the entrance. Have a great time tomorrow in Dunedin, and for now we're enjoying favorable weather again. In just this stretch from here to Dunedin, we normally go through 4 forecast areas, and by the time you print one out, the weather has changed already normally, so I don't even bother. I look and then I prepare for the worst, but it looks like we're in for a smooth ride all the way again, so enjoy that. One more sound to come up, and I hope you enjoyed what today had to offer so far, and I was very pleased to see so many people out on deck early this morning. Normally you can only get people up to catch a plane at 5 o'clock and not to watch scenery, but I was impressed, and I hope you enjoyed what you saw today.
So now it's time to leave Doubtful Sound and go to sea for a brief time before we turn inland again into Dusky Sound. It was cool on deck, but in our cabins there was closed circuit TV picture coming from the bridge and a commentary.
It is the area where many firsts happened in New Zealand. And I'm just going to leave you with that for a moment, and I'll come back to that in a little bit.
The scenery inside Dusky Sound was quite magnificent. The slopes had these wonderful trees, almost subtropical foliage coming right to the water's edge, and it was lush, really lush. Absolutely magnificent scenery. It was quite cool on deck now, so it's time to return to the cabin to watch our progress on the picture coming from the bridge. The closed circuit TV picture was not very good, but the commentary was excellent.
Kudos to you guys for braving the strong wind out there. It's only another maybe 25 or 20 minutes before we are back in the open ocean, so you're really getting to experience everything that Fjordland has to offer, so I think that's just great. As I mentioned before, it is the longest of the 14 sounds on the west coast. So it's about 44 kilometers, or if you think in terms of miles, it's 26 miles. It's also the most extensive of the sounds, which can lay claim to being, as I mentioned earlier, the birthplace or cradle of New Zealand history. So lots and lots of firsts happened here. This dusky sound, as you can see, there's just no habitation. There's no houses, hotels, buildings. We only have that one hotel that we saw earlier in Milford Sound. So it remains a very isolated place, accessible only by these scheduled tourist launches. It was in 1770 that Captain Cook first came into this area in his little bark, the Endeavour, and he made his way up the west coast from the Fuvo Straits in strong winds, much stronger than this. And later, as we exit out of this dusky sound, we'll be making our way through that Fuvo Strait as well. Probably sometime in the evening hours, maybe midnight perhaps, before we get into Dunedin. But anyway, Captain Cook came in 1770 seeking shelter from those strong winds. Didn't enter because it was too close to dusk. So these sounds, although we can find sometimes dusky dolphins in here, were actually named after the fact that he came here at dusk. And he sort of noted it on the charts and knew of this presence of this fjord, but it took actually about 3 years later before, when he switched vessels onto the Resolution, and he wanted to give his crew some rest and sustenance after spending 4 tempestuous months in the Antarctic. So he headed for this dusky sound, and he dropped anchor off the eastern tip of Anchor Island, so that's just up ahead. But this was too exposed, so then he sent one of his officers out to find a safe anchorage. And this he did on the other side of the sounds and promptly named it Pickersgill Harbour. So we'll have to look carefully between the two islands once we get a little bit closer up to this dusky sound here. Anyway, this was the base for Cook and his crew for many weeks, and they set up an observatory with a very accurate fix of their position. That's where they obtained a lot of information and the charts. They had to obviously cut down large trees and make a clearing to build that observatory. And to this day, when we get a little bit closer up, if we had binoculars, we could still make out the stumps of the trees cut down, albeit that's going to be covered in moss and quite challenging to see from this distance. But if we had a yacht and a whole day to spend in here, then we could easily make our way out there and to see that. Repairs were made to the Resolution. They collected fresh water in casks, and they also collected meat from many of the birds and animals that they found in this area here. So they set up New Zealand's first brewery at this little point that will be coming up called Astronomer's Point. And this is where Cook made a wholesome brew of what he called spruce beer. And it was made from the rimu, tree leaves, and to which he added juice of wort and molasses. And apparently it was only so that his crew wouldn't get scurvy. But apparently it tasted pretty good too. As you can imagine, he truly had a field day whilst on this ship when it was laid up here in this harbor. The botanist came across a vast variety of ferns and mosses that he had never seen before. So over the weeks, Cook and his crew and the botanist explored most of the sound and gave these names to many places, and some were pertaining, as I mentioned earlier, to what had happened to them on that spot, or maybe if they're really caring, they might have named them after their mother-in-laws. But just to give you some idea as to what some of the names were mentioned here, there was Goose Cove, where Captain Cook and his crew let loose some geese. There was Luncheon Cove, where they had lunch. Indian Cove, where he thought he met the so-called lost Maori tribe. And Seal Rocks will be coming up very shortly, in about 3 minutes, where they saw plenty of seals. And Duck Cove, where Captain Cook and his crew shot many ducks. And Detention Cove, where Cook's vessel, the Resolution, was detained by a lack of wind in that instance. Obviously not what we're experiencing today, but on occasion apparently they do have a lack of wind. Seals just sort of sunning themselves.
As the sun sets behind Stewart Island, Volendam is steaming east for a venue with Dunedin next morning. We're really looking forward to that. But that will be in part 2 of this video of cruising New Zealand aboard Volendam.